On a Prayer, Faith is Awaken by Elton Thomas. Episode 22, Faith or Fiction. The diner was quiet except for the occasional clatter of plates and the low murmur of conversation. Dusty Rhymes sat in the far corner, staring down at the coffee cup cradled in his hands, the steam rising from it in thin tendrils. The warmth from the cup seeped into his palms, but his mind was a cold storm of questions. He had come to this meeting hoping for answers, but the more he thought about it, the more confused he became. He glanced out the window, watching the evening light fade over St. Louis, the streets dimly lit by flickering street lamps. The city had always felt heavy, weighed down by its shadows, but tonight it felt different. Something was shifting, and Dusty couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the cusp of an understanding he wasn't sure he was ready for. Across from him, Pastor Ethan Embry sat with his hands folded in front of him, his face calm and thoughtful as he waited for Dusty to speak. The diner's dim lights cast soft shadows over the pastor's weathered features, highlighting the lines of wisdom etched into his skin. He had always seemed so sure of everything, his faith unwavering even in the face of the darkness that surrounded them. Dusty, on the other hand, wasn't sure of anything anymore. "So, you think it's all because of prayer?" Dusty finally asked, his voice low, almost reluctant. Ethan nodded slowly, his eyes filled with quiet certainty. "I do," he replied. "What you've experienced, Dust, it's more than just chance. You've been touched by something greater, something that can't be explained by logic or science alone." Dusty let out a breath, leaning back in his seat as he ran a hand through his hair. "I want to believe that," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. "But every time I get close to accepting it, my mind pulls me back. It's like, it doesn't make sense. There has to be another explanation." Ethan smiled softly, his gaze steady as he met Dusty's eyes. "It doesn't have to make sense, Dusty. Faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's more at play than what we can see or explain." Dusty's jaw tightened as he looked down at the table, his thoughts racing. He had always relied on logic, on facts. His life had been built on finding answers, on solving problems with clear solutions. But now, for the first time, he was facing something that didn't fit into any of those boxes. The powers he had felt, the way bullets had missed him, the way men had fled in fear, it couldn't be coincidence. But the idea that prayer, something so intangible, was the key to it all? That was a harder pill to swallow. "I've never prayed, Ethan," Dusty said quietly, shaking his head. "Not for myself, not for anyone." Ethan tilted his head slightly, his eyes twinkling with a knowing look. "Are you sure about that?" Dusty frowned, his confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" Ethan leaned forward, resting his arms on the table as he spoke, his voice calm but filled with quiet intensity. "Prayers aren't just about getting down on your knees and saying the right words," he explained. "Sometimes, prayers are the wishes we hold in our hearts for the people we care about. Every time you've gone after one of Jackson's victims, every time you fought to save someone who couldn't save themselves, you've been praying, Dusty. You've been wishing for good outcomes, hoping for the best. That's faith, even if you didn't realize it." Dusty's heart skipped a beat, his chest tightening as the truth of Ethan's words sank in. His whole life, he had been fighting for others, wishing, hoping, that he could save them from the darkness that had consumed their lives. Was that prayer? Was that why he had survived the impossible time and time again? Ethan smiled softly as he saw the realization dawning on Dusty's face. "Prayers work best when we pray for others," he said gently. "When we set aside our own desires and focus on the well-being of those around us. That's where true strength comes from. It's why things like greed are so self-destructive, because they're rooted in selfishness. But when you pray for someone else, when you truly wish for their well-being, that's when miracles happen." Dusty's breath caught in his throat, the weight of Ethan's words settling over him like a blanket. All this time, he had been praying without even knowing it. Every case, every victim, every person he had fought for, those had been his prayers. And maybe that was why his powers had manifested in the ways they had. Not because he was special, but because his heart had been aligned with something greater. "I've been praying," Dusty whispered, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Without even knowing it. Ethan nodded, his smile widening. You've been doing it all along, Dusty. You've been living your faith. Dusty's mind reeled, the storm of doubt and confusion finally beginning to clear. For the first time, he felt like he understood, like the pieces of the puzzle were finally falling into place. His powers, his survival, the miracles he had experienced, they weren't just accidents. They were the result of something far greater than he had ever imagined. But before he could fully process the profound realization, the door to the diner swung open with a loud creak, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Dusty's senses went on high alert, his body tensing as he saw the figures entering the diner. 3 men, all wearing dark jackets, their eyes scanning the room with cold, calculating precision. Dusty's heart sank. He recognized them immediately. Jackson's men. "Stay here," Dusty whispered to Ethan, his voice low and urgent. Ethan frowned, his eyes following Dusty's gaze to the men now standing near the counter. "Dusty!" "I'll handle this," Dusty interrupted, his voice firm but calm. He stood slowly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides as he made his way toward the door. The tension in the diner was palpable, the customers and staff watching with wide eyes as Dusty moved past them. He could feel the weight of their fear pressing down on him, but he couldn't afford to let it distract him. His mind was clear now, his purpose sharper than ever. As Dusty stepped outside, the cool night air hit him like a wave, the faint hum of the city in the background. But it wasn't the usual sounds of the city that filled his ears. It was the unmistakable click of guns being cocked. Dusty looked around, his pulse quickening as he realized that Jackson's men had surrounded the diner. They were standing in the shadows, their faces hard, their weapons raised. Dusty's breath came in short, controlled bursts as he stood there, the enormity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just an ambush. This was a message. Inside the diner, the tension was thick, the fear almost palpable as Pastor Ethan stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he began to lead a quiet prayer. The staff and customers huddled together, their eyes filled with terror as they whispered their own prayers, their voices trembling with desperation. Dusty could feel it, the energy in the air shifting around him, the quiet hum of power growing stronger with each passing second. His mind raced, but his heart was steady. He knew what he had to do. One of the men stepped forward, his gun trained on Dusty's chest. "Jackson says you're done," he snarled, his voice cold. Dusty didn't flinch. Instead, he raised his hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he focused on the power he had felt before. The power that had saved him, time and time again. The man's finger tightened on the trigger, but Dusty didn't back down. And then, something extraordinary happened. The bullets flew through the air, but they never reached Dusty. Instead, they stopped, suspended in midair, as if held by some invisible force. Dusty's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the bullets, his heart pounding in his chest. The men looked on in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief as the bullets fell to the ground with a soft clink. Dusty didn't move. He didn't need to. The power was coursing through him now, stronger than ever. In one swift motion, Dusty raised his hand again, and the guns were ripped from the men's hands, clattering to the ground as if pulled by an unseen force. The men stumbled back, their faces pale with fear, their bodies trembling as they realized they were no match for what they were facing. "Go," Dusty said quietly, his voice steady but filled with quiet authority. "You don't want this fight." The men didn't need to be told twice. They turned and fled, disappearing into the shadows as fast as they had come, their terror evident in every step they took. Dusty stood there, his chest heaving, the power still thrumming beneath his skin. He looked down at his hands, his mind racing as the enormity of what had just happened sank in. He had stopped the bullets. He had disarmed them without touching them. It wasn't just his strength. It was the prayers. Dusty turned back toward the diner, his eyes meeting Ethan's through the glass. The pastor smiled softly, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. Dusty had finally found his faith,